Right.
All right. So Rich Siegel is from the Hudson Valley area. He attended high school in
I attended high school in New Paltz. It says
New Paltz, yeah.
State University town, it says
Yeah.
there.
Are you from New Paltz?
I am.
Were you born in New Paltz?
I was born in Kingston, but went to high school here in elementary. I lived in Kingston until I was 7, so from 7 to 20 I was in New Paltz, went to school in New Paltz.
So you went through the protests of Vietnam and...
Yes, I did.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. You saw it all.
Looking back, and that's a little bit of what the book's about, I did see a lot, as a kid growing up in New Paltz, a college town, number one, and number two, the time period, the late 60s, with the Vietnam War, and a lot of the book is about that, and what my reflections on that, and growing up in a town where the Woodstock was close proximity, obviously, the actual concert, and the peace movement, and the protests against the war were all big factors in me growing up and made huge impressions on me in terms of, and one of the stories in the book is about a family who had a son go to Vietnam, and that's something that was very close to me and was my education about Vietnam and the politics of the time, and looking back at it now was some of the things that prompted me to write this book. Okay.
Yeah.
The next story I'll read from is a story about a family that lived next door to me. And this was a very personal story to write to because they had a son who ended up going to the Vietnam War, and he was drafted in, it says in the book, I think 1968. And this was a tough story because the people who were my neighbors I loved, and it's hard on them and the mother, so I'll just say that.
Let me hold the mic for you while you get your thing.
I'm sorry.
You can keep talking.
I can? Okay. I forget the order they're in sometimes too.
You have a table of contents?
Yeah.
I think it's page 70.
Yeah, I got it. I just have a hard time finding it. The name of the story is The Wall. A double-row stone wall runs between my childhood home and the Schaller family property. Over 100 years ago, before the day of electronic title searches and aerial map, landowners spent countless hours constructing the walls to clearly define their territory. At age 8, I saw the wall for the first time. This landmark that separated my family from our neighbors on one side and the woods in the back. My grandfather, a first-generation German immigrant, arrived at Ellis Island and became proprietor of a summer boarding house used by his fellow countrymen as a summer getaway. He owned enough property to gift his son and his grandson their own parcel. On this piece of land, my parents built their dream home where I grew up and where my 80-year-old dad still lives. In late June 1968, we moved into our new home, and I sat on the stone wall surveying the unfamiliar surroundings. I was hoping to catch sight of the 8 Schaller children out at play, especially one that was close to my age. My older brother was a great playmate when it suited him, which as he got older became less and less frequent. Instead of a herd of children, what I saw was a scene like a snapshot in time. I had no idea who Norman Rockwell was, but years later recognized the setting could have been captured in one of his famous paintings. I intently watched the teenage boy meticulously washing his car. He wore a bright white, freshly laundered t-shirt with a pack of cigarettes safely stored in the sleeve. His faded blue jeans were rolled at the cuff, enough to show off black kid sneakers. What I remembered most was how handsome he was, with his blonde hair slicked back and a tanned face glistening in the early summer sun. To my imaginative self, he was a James Dean look-alike, coolly shining his big black pointed chariot with an amazing sense of pride and purpose. Something about the way he focused intently on that car as he rinsed away the suds, the white suds, told me that he had places to go and people to see. The apparition turned out to be Hank Jr., the oldest of Hank and Barbara Schaller's children. It's odd, but that childhood memory is one of my earliest, and as strange as it may seem, the image has become clearer as the years have passed. What is even odder is that I never remember seeing him again after that day. I don't remember ever meeting Hank Jr. and never found out where he was dreaming of going. I never knew what his hobbies were or if he ever kissed a girl. His younger brother Jeff and I became fast playmates and were steady friends throughout high school. In spite of our closeness, I can't recall either of us ever mentioning his older brother. No record, no tribute, no mention of such a shining youthful star. He simply disappeared. That first summer in my new home, I spent a lot of time with the Schaller family. Having only one brother and one cousin, I knew very little about life in a large family. The Schallers were a close-knit brood, connected even more tightly through their devout Catholic faith and traditions. I can still see the picture of Jesus Christ prominently displayed in the kitchen. Besides Hank Jr., the 7 other children ranged in the ages from 3 to 16, 4 boys and 3 girls. The Schaller house was full of activity and noise, plenty of noise. Mrs. Schaller was an old-fashioned housewife, and being a mom of 8 was her full-time job. Dinner was served family style and began the moment Hank Sr. pushed his way through the door. Mr. Schaller was a strapping, gregarious man who stood about 6'2" and weighed close to 300 pounds. I never heard him described as fat, but his combined chest and stomach resembled a large barrel. Sure, anybody? No, never mind.
We know what you mean.
I must have eaten 20 meals that summer at the Schallers, and nobody seemed to mind that my presence meant less food to go around. I learned that if you grew up with lots of siblings, you had to be both selfish and unselfish at the same time. Selfish to make sure you dug your fork into the platter to get some food before it was all gone, and unselfish enough to not take too much so that there would be food left for everyone else. Before any grabbing for chow began, Mrs. Schaller always said grace. Mostly she thanked God and usually asked for a few favors, but there was only one request she asked of God every single night. But most of all, Lord, I beg you to keep our beautiful son Hank safe wherever he may travel. Amen. My parents' explanation was that Hank Jr. won some sort of lottery that summer. His draft number was picked 6th out of 365, and because of that, he was going on a trip overseas courtesy of the United States Army. Dad told me the name of the country where Hank was going, but since I never heard of the country, it did not register for a long time. That explained our government needed Hank and many other young men to go fight against people who were enemies of the United States. Keep going.
Yes.
The spring of the following year was more welcome than usual because the winter of 1969 dumped record-breaking snowfalls on New Paltz. By April, there was some semblance of ice left from some of the taller drifts. During the winter and spring, about once a week, just before dinner time, my mom sent me to the Schallers loaded with platters of food. I dreaded that trek across the wall. For a previously loud and boisterous family, the stillness I encountered at the house haunts me still. Wow. Sorry.
I feel it too.
From the beginning of these food-laden trips, I found Mrs. Schaller sitting motionless at the kitchen table. She never acknowledged my presence, and the only indication that she was alert was when she reached for a half-empty glass of clear liquid that sat in front of her. She picked up the glass and stared at its contents as if looking for something. Without expression, she caressed the rim with her lips and drank tiny sips. Jesus was missing from his place of honor on the wall. In contrast, Mr. Schaller was jovial and especially welcoming. "Put it right down there, Richie, my boy," he bellowed in a friendly yet stern voice. "Have you been telling your mom and dad that Barbara and I really appreciate their help?" "I have, Mr. Schaller. They said you're welcome and let me know whatever else is needed." "We've got great neighbors, don't we, Barbara?" he always retorted with a touch of a slur to his own words. Mrs. Schaller continued staring blankly at her glass as if there was no one else in the room. "Bye, Mr. Schaller. Tell Jeff he can come up and play later," I'd say, and anxiously scurry out the door. As far as I know, Mrs. Schaller never cooked another meal, washed another load of clothes, or prayed another word to Jesus. In the remainder of the time that I knew her, she did nothing more than sit at the kitchen table. After a while, she went away to live in what was described to me as a resting home. A strong, well-grounded religious woman with 7 children to take care of simply quit. She gave up her family. She surrendered her own life, and she turned her back on God. One day, a happy-go-lucky housewife, the next, a mute, crazed, and distant lady. It was approximately 5 years before Hank Sr. sent his wife to the rest home permanently. Hank Schaller Sr. was a well-meaning man, but not a particularly nurturing single parent. He was a builder by trade in a time when constructing homes for people who lived in a hamlet was deemed a high level of honor. Hank worked hard and drank harder. I never saw any indication that he was an abusive drinker, but it was well known that if he wasn't working, you could find Hammer and Hank pounding down rye and gingers at the VFW bar. A non-communicative mother and an alcoholic father left 7 yearlings to fend for themselves. Even a naive, sheltered boy like myself, it was evident this lack of parental support and influence negatively impacted the Schaller children. 2 of the remaining sons had numerous brushes with the law, most for mischievous stuff like drinking, drugging, and petty theft. The 3 girls grew up far too quickly and all became single teen mothers in an era when giving birth out of wedlock was taboo. Jeff, literally the middle of 7, was the one I knew the best and was a valued childhood friend and neighbor. He was a big, strong guy with a gigantic heart, but a misguided look on life. More for lack of guidance than lack of brains, Jeff had little direction. While he excelled on the athletic fields, he was cavaliering when it came to his academics. By the time Jeff and I were juniors in high school, I picked him up in my car every day, and the 2 of us shared a 10-minute ride to New Paltz High. At a time in my life when wardrobe certainly was not a priority in my mind, Jeff's lack of one was blatantly obvious. Throughout high school, he rotated the same 3 pair of jeans and 3 t-shirts. Despite the obvious lack of parental support and care, Jeff had good friends and was a good friend. If I had to pick 3 other people to be in the proverbial foxhole life with, Jeff would be one of them. Despite his good looks, affable personality, and penchant for working hard, his life never got on track that matched his potential. The last I heard, he married young, has 2 daughters in their late 20s, drives a school bus, and has had his own challenges with alcohol.
Let's take a breather. This is very moving, very, very moving. We can feel your, yes, and that family.
This was the hard story for me to write, obviously. And this was not personal for me. This was it was just me having. It was personal in the way that it didn't happen to me, yet I was, as I'll say later in the story, ashamed of myself for my lack of knowledge of it and lack of understanding, and not for her plight. And I wanted to be real careful in the story not to be judgmental, because it's easy to say she gave up like I did sometime, and then one of the things I wanted to always be careful was not be judgmental. This was just my looking back on what I saw, and what I saw was a great family that was torn apart by that war, a strong family, a Catholic, strong, together family that was just completely split apart by, I say just one thing, but the fact that he was drafted into the war and he was lost in the war at the age of 20 in Vietnam. Yeah. So with all the things that were going around then, and especially then, my parents were very conservative people. So looking back, you guys remember, most of the people were supportive of the war. The right wing at that time. It was like if you weren't, you were kind of the hippie-ish rabble-rouser or draft dodger or went to Canada. Now, certainly our attitude has completely changed on that. But I grew up in a family where country is right no matter what, the president's right no matter what, the war is right. So you didn't look at it as a waste or what the heck are we doing there in Vietnam like a lot of us do now. So looking back and seeing that kind of tragedy happen and trying to understand and make sense of it all was challenging, but I think it's a good story. I think it's real, and I think it's something that we all can think about. We all were touched by the Vietnam War in some way or another. And again, I don't know, looking around, if any of you had children who went there, or you had brothers, or you had nephews, or you had neighbors, but in some way you can think back where you were at that time, what was going on. And also all the things that went around it. The civil rights movement, the peace movement, we'll call it the hippie movement. I mean, those all had big impacts on all of us. And I'm assuming you guys are probably 10 to 15 years older than me. So you guys were in the 60s, mid-20s for the most part. So, you had missed the draft, gentlemen. Like, you missed the draft completely?
It's a long story. I didn't miss it. But
Oh, you got out of it or whatever.
yeah.
Well, when you hear this, what do you think? What does anything bring any memories to you, or
Oh, yes.
is that you're lucky, or?
It's only
Yeah.
because our son was born that at that time you could get out if you had a child. and I think it saved his life.
Yeah, and as I was driving down here with a gentleman who was filming with me and one of my assistants over here, we were talking about the Vietnam War, and I was saying one of the big differences now, there's not it's a volunteer draft. So at least the people who are there, not that it makes it any better, but they've chosen to be there. Somebody like Hank Schaller, it was the lottery, and they said, you're going, and you went, or you went to jail, or you went to Canada. You didn't have a choice in the matter. So I think that there's a big difference there. And, you know, when you got to look as a parent, or as that person that, you know, this was something, the war that our country was fighting, and I lost somebody who was 20, and then taking a look at, okay, what did he miss? What did he miss? Think about it.
And,
You know.
and the people that were born in, and the people that were born in the 90s and in the 21st century, when we talk to them about Vietnam, it's ancient history. And that's why it's important to write about it, even if it's people we know.
Yeah.
You have to keep that alive. Yes. Do you need a mic?
No, I don't think so. I'm wondering, when you're writing a book, it sounds like such a challenging thing to do. And I'm wondering if you went through times of extreme doubt, whether you're going to be successful or not. And if so, what did you do about it? How did you get through that?
With the book?
Yeah.
So, yeah. Very good question, by the way. Really, it is. Yes, there were a zillion times I had. It took 3 years. The book's 117 pages long. And I had a family and another career. It took 3 years for me to get it down. I changed things a million times. I always thought I wanted to write a book and write books, but never thought I had the discipline to do it. I would always say to myself, even in my 30s and 40s, saying, I can't sit down and be quiet. You gotta be quiet. I can't all week long think about it and take notes. So to answer your question, you have to do those things. You have to make a determination in your mind that you're gonna do it. And for me, it was kind of chapter by chapter, that I would get an idea in my head and that's all I would think about, and I would make notes. Now I gotta go in on a Saturday afternoon and a Sunday afternoon, and from 11 to 1 at night, and sit there and put those notes together into some kind of workable story and write a book. So it is unbelievably challenging. I mean, I have so much respect for people who can just sit there and do it. And then you have to make so many changes, and you have to read it 1,000 times, and then it never sounds right to you. I'm dead serious. The people had to pull this thing away from me, the manuscript, and say, that's it, all right, we're going to put it together now, because I would read it for the 100th time, and there were things I wanted to change.
You know
So
what Hemingway
how do I?
said? You know what Hemingway said
No,
about
I don't.
Ernest Hemingway? Someone asked him, when's the book done? And he said, when you shoot the author.
That's good. No, I did not hear that. But your question was, how do you overcome all of those obstacles? And I think it's just, for me anyway, it was a will. It was just a discipline that I am going to do this. And then when you get to a certain point, you can't, you just know. I mean, I'm the type of person that the other way also I got through was I kept telling people that I was writing a book, because then I know I have got to get it done. And it's the same thing with the second book. I have been saying, on blogs, that my second book's on the way, and it's like, and I've even talked to publishers about being paid to write the second book, and negotiating with them and reading this, and have been given little bits of money to write it, but I'm saying I'm writing it and I'll give you more, and it's still a struggle. But the more I say it, if I sit here and say, hey, my second book's coming out, that's a motivation for me, like tomorrow, to say, what have you done lately, Rich? Where are you? Where are you going? And that's a day-to-day struggle that I'm telling you have to if your question is, how do you overcome it? You have to overcome it day-to-day. And it is easy. It makes going to the gym nothing. Like saying, okay, you want to go to the gym, but I really don't want to go to the gym, and you talk yourself out of it some days. Writing, you stop for a week and you can say, okay, this is a lot better, a lot less pressure. It is hard work, and for somebody like me, who has never been that disciplined and never thought that they could do this kind of tedious work, it's been kind of a proud feeling for my own self that I've kind of overcome that. Like I always wanted to feel like, oh, I got nothing to do. When you're writing a book, you never rest. Your mind is never stopping.